I mean, even Santa Claus struggled to get presents. Just to be clear here, so a lot of presents were made out of what was available at the time.
Welcome to a brand new podcast. Iain McLean is a writer and the author of TJ's War. David Blair is an actor and the narrator of the audiobook TJ's War. David and Iain have been listening to their readers and listeners and have decided to turn TJ's War into a movie. And since the story covers the entirety of World War II, the movie will cost at least $50 million. Will David and Iain succeed in their quest? Follow them in this podcast series. We're going to make a $50 million movie.
Hey, it's the podcast. We're making a $50 million TV series. We've actually come to figure out it's going to cost a hell of a lot more than that, but I digress. Today, given the time of year and the backdrop of our story, we're exploring what Christmas was like during one of the darkest periods in modern history, World War II. Across battlefields and home fronts, soldiers and civilians alike found ways to celebrate the holiday, even in the face of unimaginable hardships. From bomb shelters in London to makeshift celebrations on the front lines, from prisoners of war finding hope in captivity to families adopting traditions under rationing and occupation. Christmas during World War II was a testament to human resilience and creativity. I'm joined today by the author of the book, Iain McLean, as well as the voice behind the audiobook, David Blair, and our favorite cohort, Syya, yes, Tornrat. How should we begin? I assume we frame the time period. Let's start with the first wartime Christmas. Uh, you know, Iain, can you tell us about what was Christmas like in 1939? Of course, 2 years later, in 1941, after Pearl Harbor, it becomes just a global affair for sure. But Christmas 1939, take us there, Iain.
Okay, so Christmas 1939 was not terribly different from 1938. This was during the period that was called the Phony War. Now, there's plenty of war going on, but most of it was in Poland. Supplies were still getting through. There were a number of ships sunk in 39, much more in 1940. But in general, supplies were getting through, and people right across the UK were not really at home, suffering from any deprivation. Across in France, a lot of our soldiers went across with the British Expeditionary Force into France and into Belgium. Well, not into Belgium, actually, onto the edge of it, to set up what became known as the Maginot Line of fortifications that went all the way down from near enough the French coast through to about 300 miles short of Switzerland. In 1939, right across the board, Christmas was celebrated typically with army regiments. On Christmas Day, the officers would serve the privates, the non-commissioned men in a regiment, and that certainly happened right across the various places where British forces were in Christmas 1939. Very easy. Christmas 1940, very different. By that point, we had experienced in the UK the Blitzkrieg, bombing of London, Battle of Britain had happened before that, the loss of France. A large number of troops had been lost, either taken prisoner or killed at the British Expeditionary Force. Survivors had managed to get back across through Dunkirk. So, in many ways, the country was at a low ebb, and supplies of everything were running short. The war effort was still to ramp up, so there was this dip where supplies were short, and there weren't enough resources in place and processes in place to bring the resources back up. So it could be argued in 1940, probably more likely 1941, but around that time we had the worst Christmas of the lot. Where people had Christmas, where children had Christmas presents, they were being made. I mean, even Santa Claus struggled to get presents. Just to be clear here, so a lot of presents were made out of what was available at the time. Soldiers would be carving little wooden whistles and so on to get them back to their children or to their nephews and nieces. Sugar, especially, was in very short supply, so there was very little that was sweet. It was a very austere Christmas for anyone in Europe. Much worse, of course, in the areas such as Poland and France and so on. But it wasn't very good in Britain either. America, 1941, they essentially, although Pearl Harbor had happened and although it was shocking to the United States and they lost 2,500 men and women in Pearl Harbor, apart from that, and apart from knowing they were in the war now and Germany had declared war on America as well as Japan, people didn't really suffer in America. I think they probably felt they were going to have one last blast before things got hot.
There had to have been, though, this just gloomy element to it. Like, the only thing that we had to compare it to in the modern, for our generations is I think post 9/11, just a few months after 9/11, I can remember that Christmas just feeling, it almost felt wrong to celebrate because it felt like we still weren't sure what was coming next, what was going to happen with the whole world. And I can only imagine that World War II era, that's just magnified times 10.
I would suggest to you it's actually the opposite. We have tremendous communication these days. We've got the internet, so anything happening across the world we find out about immediately. Back in 1941, you tended to get your news either from the wireless, as it was called, or in the cinema screens. And so Pearl Harbor, when it happened, went right across the world, never mind America. But within a few weeks, things had kind of moved on. And people were able to get on with their lives because it's not been rammed down your throats every single day. It's very different today. In fact, I think there's a good argument for public today suffering PTSD every time there's a major disaster because it's just everywhere you turn.
Right.
You're seeing it again and again. So in America, from what I've gathered, Christmas 1941 was still good, still a good time.
Did the US have rationing?
Yes, we did. We absolutely did. And it was starting to kick off by the end of 41. It didn't really begin in earnestness, I think, until about 42. There was rumblings prior to. So yes, Pearl Harbor was a shock, but it wasn't a like, oh my gosh, where did this come from? Like there was inklings. We already knew things were happening along those lines because you saw this anti-Japanese sentiment already starting to form. And then after Pearl Harbor, it just went into like peak mode. And that's when, our Japanese internment camps were activated. And it wasn't just the Japanese, by the way. There were other internment camps that were there that we just don't talk about as much in America. But the Japanese were obviously easily singled out. But it's funny. When we had this conversation of this topic, I thought I would throw up some websites to just get a background and understanding. But for 18 months, Winston Churchill had been petitioning FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our president at the time, to join on the Allies side. I mean, he was pushing really, really hard. So when Pearl Harbor had happened, he was excited. So he was in the United States 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, and to just solidify and ensure that, hey, yeah, I know you guys got bombed by, the Japanese, but hey, there's a war in Germany, in England, over here too, in Europe, that we need you to help us with. So he petitioned hugely after he spoke in front of Congress. He ensured that the United States would be right in lockstep with uh, the UK government.
Yeah. He did something very similar when Germany turned on Russia. As soon
Yeah.
as Operation Barbarossa kicked off, Churchill had a number of ships coming across, and he directed them to not come to the UK with their supplies. Didn't matter what they were. Russians couldn't use a lot of the supplies that were on those ships. Didn't matter. He sent them over the top to Russia to just ram home the fact that that Britain was supporting Russia and Stalin in their fight against the Germans now. And that was very clever.
I think there's something to be said about what you had mentioned, you touched on, Ian. We are in America isolated. For all intents and purposes, we're basically an island, right? Because we don't have, other than Canada and Mexico, we don't have different countries all over the place pressuring us in a very intimate way. And so I think we weren't getting bombed. I mean, Pearl Harbor got bombed, but that was out in the Pacific Ocean. Even Hawaii was foreign to us, right, as continental United States. So it felt very, very removed. There was a lot of patriotism, though, and a lot of the Americans did activate themselves. So they, according to the History Channel here, I'll just shout out as I'm reading these references. Americans stopped eating turkey because they wanted that to go, the turkey meat to go towards the soldiers. So they started, they didn't cut down trees, for example, and which I thought the irony is they had plastic trees. So I guess they activated the plastic. There was no metal to play with. So these are all plastic trees, and they wouldn't light them up because you could set them on fire because the plastics and the lighting and all that good stuff. But,
really? They had plastic during the Second World War?
yeah.
I can appreciate that.
That's apparently, it said, yeah, according to, again, History Channel peoples, that's all I'm going to say. Women started playing Santa Claus roles, artificial trees goes up, lights stay off.
Wow.
So, I mean, but those little details do matter for Americans because, like I said, for us, especially in 42, like there's no TV. We have radio, but even then it's still the mind's eye. So the fact that I think the country could rally and support the war effort without even seeing or knowing or hearing it, I think that's very noble, I guess, for people to rally and support one another and not really have a clue what's going on.
Mark, I'm thinking about, you're currently in Japan, of course. I say that as if you go in and out, but you're based there.
Yes.
Any idea what it was like in Japan for Christmas during the war? I mean, they don't have Christmas, do they?
I was going to say, I mean, it's celebrated today, but I mean, it's a completely commercial holiday. You know what the Japanese tradition is for Christmas today? To eat KFC.
Oh yeah.
To eat Kentucky Fried Chicken. I'm not kidding. You can ask like any Japanese person, like, what do you do for Christmas in Japan? Oh, I eat KFC. And Christmas is actually more of a couples holiday than it is a family holiday. Like, Christmas is almost like a Valentine's Day or something. It's what you spend it with your significant other. You don't because the family gathering happens a week later at New Year's.
Right.
So, but yeah, so in 1941, I mean, Japanese people aren't celebrating Christmas at all. It's not a Christian country, and other than whatever missionaries might have been here, it wouldn't have been celebrated.
Fascinating. I asked my mother, who's still alive, 96, what Christmas was like for her during the war, and she said it was great because my grandfather had a farm in the north of Scotland, so they cattle, sheep, pigs, and a number of different grains as well that they grew. So during the summer every year, it didn't matter whether it was a war or not, but during the summer they would make butter and they'd make cheese, and they'd have herring. So my grandfather would trade meat to the fishermen for herring, take the herring back, salt them, put them in barrels. So all the way through the summer, the farm, my grandmother and the wives of the farm workers, because there was 20 farm workers on the farm, would be preparing food for the winter. And some of it would be prepared for the Christmas, and more especially in the north of Scotland, we celebrated New Year more than Christmas. So even beer was being made on the farm. And the local distillery from my grandfather, was half a mile away. So there was no deprivation for my mother's family throughout the war. And I think that was probably true for a number of people in that kind of situation where they were in farms. They had a tradition of being completely self-sufficient. Even without refrigeration, they had means of keeping food for long periods of time so they could use it when they needed.
How did this is just a left turn question. How did leaders like Churchill and Roosevelt use Christmas speeches? What did they say at the time?
Funny you should ask. So
Good
so
question.
like Churchill literally parked his hiney at the White House to ensure that they were able to get the and I think you'll get this down better than I do. I just passed it.
You're talking
It
about
was
1941.
Christmas 1941. There was a speech that Roosevelt had given off the White House, and there's a picture, you guys. This is the FDR Foundation. Now I'm on the website, and there's a picture of FDR standing up at the podium, and there's a it's a behind the scenes picture, and there's a gentleman propping him up because he was paralyzed at that point. So it's fascinating to see Churchill off to the side while FDR gave his speech. But the day after Christmas, Churchill, he addressed the joint session of Congress, and he reminded everyone, and this is another fact that we tend to overlook, is he's half American. His mom was what do they call them, you guys? Dollar princesses, I think they called them back in the day.
Wow.
And if you guys aren't familiar with that term, back in the turn of the century or so, there were folks from your place in the UK that were nobility, but they were effectively broke. So they would marry off rich American women so they can inject money back into to keep their titles and keep their lands and keep their property. So they call them dollar princesses, I think they're called. And so Churchill is one of those. His mom was an heiress to some, I don't know, I think a dad was like a trading person, fish and trade person. So I know, random trivia fact that I'm completely butchering. Someone else fact check me, but he is half American. But anyway, so during Christmas Day, there was a speech that was given, and it was the Joint Declaration of Unity and Purpose for the Allies. And that was given on the morning of December 29th. And it had additional countries signed in: Australia, Belgium, Canada, Costa Rica, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, a lot of Dominican Republic, Greece. So a lot of Latin America, Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway joined, which I think is interesting. And it goes all the way down: Egypt, Ethiopia, France, Iraq, Lebanon, Liberia. So there's a lot of Philippines. So out there in Asia, it was really interesting to see this because this group would become the founding members of the United Nations because they signed this pact. And he read it off to everybody, and I thought that was interesting. I guess I don't know if that answered your question or not, as I'm kind of reading the notes here.
I'm actually asking across the spectrum of World War II. So each year, 42, 43, 40, were there notable speeches that occurred during Christmas time? I presume there were. That, I mean, by 1943 or so, by 1944, we had won in Europe, right?
No.
Okay.
The war.
I mean, I know the war goes into 1940.
But we hadn't won.
I mean, by the time that we end the war with the Japanese in August of 1945. The war in Europe had ended.
That's correct. War in Europe ended in 8th of May 1945.
May. Right. Okay, May. But
But
even
before you continue with that question, Mark,
sure.
I know that David's stuck in a car and his phone is very low power.
Sure.
He's about to lose battery any minute. So I want to get David involved in this conversation before he disappears.
He's rationing as well, yeah.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes,
Yeah.
you're fine.
It's a bit sketchy at this end. I'm sort of, if I'm looking a bit vacant, it's because the reception's not great. It's probably because I'm just vacant anyway, but
We're not told.
I'm kind of half trying to keep up.
Where
yes.
were your family during the Second World War?
Mum is from the Midlands, and her father was, I don't know how old he would have been in the Second World War, but he was, I think he was probably past fighting age, and he was a fireman, but not sort of general fireman. He was a fireman in the ICI factory, like the local chemical factory.
Wow.
So he was often on call there. And Mum was born just like at the start of the war, so she doesn't have many memories of the war. Lost relatives, fathers that didn't come back. Dad's an Aussie, so he was his dad. He remembers his dad. He just about remembers his dad before the war, and he was a reasonably cheerful, outgoing chap. And then when he came back, totally different. He ended up becoming a magistrate, but was very quiet and never really talked about the war. What it was like around Christmas, I don't know. But
Quiet,
yeah,
I would think.
Yeah, there was so many. As we've highlighted in the book, there was just so many. Just about every family was hit by, if it wasn't directly someone at the front that had died, there was an impact somehow, I think.
Just for our American friends here, ICI is Imperial Chemicals Industry in something. The I stands for something like that. But ICI was a major target for the Germans during the war. Any kind of chemical production was being hit. So your grandfather, who was a fireman, he would have absolutely seen service during that time, dealing with Nazi attempts to bomb the thing that he was trying to protect. All over the country, there were these factories.
Never really talked about it.
Yeah, well, aircraft manufacturers, armaments manufacturers, and chemical manufacturers were key targets for the Germans during the war.
Do you have any knowledge of how Jewish people kept Hanukkah during that time?
Not really. I've got some Jewish friends I can go off and ask and come back to you on that one.
All right.
But there's a very strong Jewish community in London, in the north of London. And I think that grew between the First and Second World War. As refugees, especially refugees from Germany, managed to escape and come across to the UK. Some of them went then across to the US, but a lot of them stayed in the UK and would have been in the north of London during the war. So London was all the way through the back end of 1940 was just getting bombed left, right, and center, and into 1941 as well. So,
I mean, of course, the Diary of Anne Frank is set, or a good portion of the diary is set around Christmas time,
right?
And I mean, but she's Jewish. How did the Axis and Allied countries differ in their approach to Christmas morale?
Well, before you go there, if I could just interject at least this one. So I did a quick look through for the Jewish American experience. And for them, there was a huge participation in World War II. So there was a lot of patriotism for America. There was anxiety about, obviously, the Nazi regime. And so there was a lot of American Jews that served. And on the home front, there was a huge patriotic push to support the war effort. So there was it was almost patriotism first, but fueled by, obviously, the uncertainty that was going on in Europe. But there was anti-Semitism. It just wasn't as blatant as, obviously, as things were going on, but it was there. So there was a very strong anti-Semitism current in the United States at that time, and I think we don't talk about it enough. The experience, unfortunately, there was definitely some folks that were very pro-Nazi. They were a little bit more subtle about it after the bombing and after they entered World War, but before, Ford was a known Nazi sympathizer, and there were some very high-profile politicians who were very sympathetic to the Nazi regime. So it wasn't until 41 there were people that were just thought they were another political party that, hey, we should back them up. And so I think we have to take that into consideration as well.
We cover part of that in the book. There's a significant part about realizing that a lot of the major Nazi sympathizers of the Bund, as they called it in America, had disappeared shortly after war was declared. A, because they knew they were going to get rounded up by the authorities, but B, because they wanted to get involved in the war themselves. And now Germany had declared war on America, they had free reign to do so. So that was very much part of several chapters of the book.
Guys, sadly, my time here is running quite low. I might need to stop for petrol as well, and my phone is the only means of payment I've got.
No, do that, yeah, please.
Now look at that, something that is very American and modern that would not have happened in World War II, right?
None of this would have happened in World War II.
They're very useful and everything, phones, but if they go,
well,
I'm so sorry. I've maybe we could cut this bit out, but
no.
Sorry.
We'll say goodbye to you, David. Thank you very much for everything you've done this year. In terms
likewise,
of
guys. Likewise, you guys have been fantastic.
And driving this film forward.
You guys
and
have been
may I take this opportunity to wish you and your family a very Merry Christmas.
And
we'll catch up again in 2025. You take care.
Yeah.
Merry Christmas.
You're gonna have me crying, Iain. See you guys.
Bye.
To find out more about the book, visit tjswar.com, and to buy it, click on the Amazon link below. To accompany us on our journey, please subscribe to this podcast because we're going to make a $50 million movie.